Time now for World Watchers International with Mae Brussell, who for over 17 years has investigated and exposed political conspiracies worldwide. World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 516, and it's October the 25th, 1981. The bulk of the broadcast this evening will be about American terrorism, homegrown terrorism, and some connections that are breaking between the East Coast, the CIA, and various people on the East Coast to a block of offices and relationships on the West Coast, specifically the David Berkowitz story and the Wilson and Terpil story, which made a giant leap in the last several weeks or months and are now landing on the West Coast where they belong and to be analyzed properly as having originated from the West Coast as part of their operations. And I'll go into particulars in a minute on that. There are many articles and editorials coming out on the lack of foreign policy of Ronald Reagan, and the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. People are asking, what is his foreign policy? What are the differences between Mr. Pipes and Walter Stessel, Alexander Haig, Richard Allen, William Casey, and Caspar Weinberger? These people are very naive. They have not studied Ronald Reagan. They should have. He was around here for 8 years in California. He has a very simple foreign policy. It's attack the Russians, help the rich, and keep secrets. Lock up the secrets at home, protect the criminals, and help those people that make you richer, decorate your house, and the oil profits go back recycled into other investments. Keep the rich flowing and appreciating their profits, and tighten up on the others, and tell the Russians how lousy they are every time you make a speech. That's his foreign policy, and he hides behind smiles when he goes on trips, such as the recent one to Mexico or up in Canada. But when he gets home, he and his agents with their big mouths, or one article referred to the big lips, don't make a foreign policy. But in his case, they make a foreign policy. But there were things in the news this week that I didn't like, and I don't think you appreciated either. One was Major General Robert Schweitzer from the National Security Council telling us we better get ready for war, that the United States is going to strike. And he was removed and put in another office because he allegedly didn't clear this with Mr. Richard Allen of the National Security Council, but he claims that he did clear it, and they said go on out and say it and see where the flack goes. Earlier this year, Richard Pipes, the specialist on the Soviet Union, said, in quotes, war with the Soviet Union is inevitable unless Moscow changes its political system. Mr. Schweitzer said the seed of pacifism is sweeping over Europe, and we're not immune to it in this country, where bishops and churchmen have been extremely unhelpful in trying to deal with the realities of the communist threat down in Latin America. Now, at the time the Pope was shot, I said that one reason for trying to kill the Pope at this time was that we were going to begin a bloodbath in Central and South America, wiping out native populations in El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and the Central America, Cuba, surround Cuba, probably immediately killing Fidel Castro. And because it is a Catholic country with political activists, Catholic activists, the Pope, I don't think, would go along with this. And I said at the time that one of the motives for shooting the Pope was to get rid of this particular Pope because of his inclinations maybe to sympathize with those native populations. And that also was the reason to murder John Lennon in December 1980, just before Reagan came into power with these people, because he certainly, combined with the Beatles, could bring out the feeling of pacifism. To repeat again, Mr. Schweitzer said the seed of pacifism is sweeping over Europe, and we're not immune to it in this country. Bishops and churchmen are extremely unhelpful in dealing with those threats down in Latin America and also the United States. Caspar Weinberger had some more war talk this week, head of the War Council. He had a warning to the United States pacifists that if they are appeasing the Soviet Union, it's similar to appeasing Nazi Germany and Japan in the 30s. To coexist with the Soviet Union is to have appeasement. Ronald Reagan softened that up and said Reagan Reagan's, he had a remark about limited war in Europe that stirred up the Allies, and then the limited war comments were softened. No, we would go to war too. We'd help our allies. We wouldn't just leave the warfare on the doorstep of the Europeans if we fought the Russians. Reagan had set off a flap in Europe about the nuclear war. And then Weinberger said and reassured them, along with Reagan, no, the United States will fight with you if we have a nuclear war. We won't abandon you in a time of a limited nuclear war. We'll go in and fight with you. And then Reagan responded later in the news. He denounced the talk of war as confined just to Europe. He said it's outright deception to believe a nuclear war would be limited to Europe as part of the U.S. strategic planning. We've got to have it all over the place. So he assured you, don't worry, it won't be limited to Europe. We'll have it everywhere else you want it. And Weinberger then was issuing reports later in the week of warning to the Soviet Union that the Soviet ideology, he said, in quotes, is shop-worn, uninspiring, and hypocritical facade for a system which exploits those it professes to advance. Weinberger didn't talk about South Africa or the broader bands or Argentina or Paraguay or Chile or South Korea or the Philippines or Brazil or Haiti or Guatemala or Uruguay or Taiwan or any military dictatorship we support. He said the Soviets have a hypocritical facade and they exploit people that they profess to advance. Keep in mind the United States doesn't exploit the people we profess to advance. We don't exploit them at all, not at all. The worst example, of course, is ITT, United Fruit, and some of the American corporations. And then some scientists responded that the radiation estimates weren't worth the paper they were written on, that the radiation from nuclear weapons is 50 times much greater than government and industry leaders estimate. And then the Senate moved this week 86-0 to send aid to Chile as they did to Argentina, that they would send arms to General Pinochet, even though high Chilean officers were indicted and never extradited for responsibility of a murder in Washington, D.C. of Orlando Letelier and his aide, Ms. Moffat. The Senate moved 86-0 to send arms to Chile again, and a little while ago they voted that for Argentina. That's foreign policy, United States version. Then out of California, we had a U.S. state senator running for U.S. Senator, Mr. Schmidt, a member of the John Birch Society, and John Schmitz, rather, from Newport Beach, and he said what this country needs is a military coup. The only way to save yourself from internal decay or military attack is a good military coup. That is what is needed. That nations, like people, have an instinct for survival, and there are a lot of things you have to do to stay alive, and that we're at the stage where a military coup would be okay. To waive constitutional traditions is the way we should survive. He's running for U.S. Senator, as I say, and he believes that you have to behave radically someday. He said, we're going to get war, or we're going to have radical surgery, and we may have internal collapse. The best thing you can hope for in the United States is a military coup. Now, not only is John Schmitz a member of the John Birch Society, but he softens the way for the fact, which I have said repeatedly for many, many years, and ever since I've been on the air, that the military coup took place in Dallas. If you don't understand that the South, California, and from Florida and California to Southwest Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, if you don't believe that they won the Civil War at the end of the era in the 60s when John Kennedy was assassinated, then you have to reread some of the current history or the literature, the economy of today to see where the power is. The power and the strength is in Houston, Texas, and in Florida. Always was in California with the aerospace, with the Hughes and the General Dynamics and the Boeing, the headquarters of Fairchild and Lockheed, major aircraft firms, Philco, Ford, and so forth, Roy Ash, Litton Industries, Rand Corporation. The Southern Belt won that conflict when John Kennedy was murdered and the presidency was given to Lyndon Johnson, and then the California boys of Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon. I received from a friend in Texas who subscribes to these programs the most shocking, disgusting news I've seen in a long time, and that has to top some of the news stories of the week. It's from the Dallas Morning News, and we didn't get it out here. It'll come maybe 1 or 2 months later. October 21st, 1981. Ronald Reagan revives his intelligence board. Now, he's trying to stop freedom of information. He wants to prosecute people who name agents. He wants to unleash the CIA and the police departments, as they have been doing ever since the CIA was formed and training down in Panama for terror and torture and their death squads that exist in this country. He wants the CIA back in the police department. He wants the CIA into organizations where it can overtake policy. Now he's going to revive the intelligence board that wasn't active since the years of Eisenhower and the Cold War, and he has reversed the decision of Jimmy Carter to have this Presidential Intelligence Advisory Board, and he chose among it 5 Texans. There's 19 members and 5 Texans. And who would you think would be on it? Ronald Reagan's choice. Ross Perot of Dallas, who worked with Mitchell Warbell in various counterintelligence operations very close to the Iranian CIA operations and the Shah. Ross Perot, the controversial man of Dallas. Former Texas Governor John Connally, who had a major role in hiding the assassination of John Kennedy and has worked with the CIA, with the Nazis down in Montego Bay, with the Intrepid Group, the Permindex operations, one of the chief of the covert operation experts of the entire Cold War assassination syndrome, John Connally. He put Leon Jaworski of Houston, Texas, a man that let the Nazis off at the Nuremberg trials, was on the Warren Commission and concealed the conspiracy, again, with the Nazis involved in the Kennedy assassination, covered up the Watergate investigation, the Koreagate investigation. He's on the intelligence board. And then Edward Bennett Williams is on this board. Edward Bennett Williams is the attorney for John Hinckley, the man that shot at Ronald Reagan, for Robert Vesco, for John Connally, and I've done many programs on Edward Bennett Williams. He's Mr. CIA, Defense Department, and Navy Intelligence combined, as was John Connally, who was Secretary of the Treasury at one time and Secretary of the Navy, and Ambassador Claire Booth Luce. There's a section in the book by Malachi Martin on the final conclave, how the CIA with John Connally and Claire Luce were conniving with Michael Sindona and various people. Even though Claire Luce is a Catholic, it brought down the Catholic Church to the point of bankruptcy, and it's becoming untangled or more tangled today in financial problems and linkage with organized crime and interlocking intelligence operations. The Vatican is in deep trouble. Well, Claire Booth Luce had a lot of fingers in that. And then Thomas Muir is on this board. He's the one with Henry Kissinger that was taking papers off of Richard Nixon's desk, the President of the United States, with Yeoman Redford, and reading them. And Alexander Haig and Kissinger were literally just stealing and wiping out Richard Nixon's desk when he was president. Instead of being prosecuted at Watergate, he's on this board with also businessman Alfred Bloomingdale and a retired aviation executive, Robert Six. And then the Intelligence Oversight Board, he has W. Glenn Campbell from Stanford University, Hoover Institute on War, Revolution, and Peace. This group of characters, it covers the whole era, particularly from the Kennedy assassination up to the present, even up to the shooting of Ronald Reagan, so that he has some beautiful plums that have been involved in the various conspiracies I've talked about. Now, they will review international, domestic intelligence and report to him on the operations. Can you imagine what kind of conversations these people will carry? As far as the coup taking place, these are the people that were in the coup in Dallas. These are the people that still cover up the murders of a president, of civil rights leaders, of a senator who ran for president, and hundreds, literally hundreds of other murders also, with their role in the intelligence community. And to top that off, I received from the same party an article from, this is also from the Dallas Morning News, Texas on the Potomac, and the Texans have moved in. They even described George Bush as being one bullet away from being president. right in this article from the Dallas Morning News, Texas on the Potomac. It talks about Representative Phil Graham, the conservative who worked with David Stockman to cut those budget cuts the way that Ronald Reagan wanted them. Vice President George Bush, the most powerful man in Washington under Reagan, who they describe, as I say, as one bullet away, a heartbeat away from the presidency, is how they describe George Bush. And James Baker, who used to be campaign manager for Bush, is now Reagan's chief of staff. So see how easily he would fit in if Reagan dies, or how much they control Reagan even at this point. And with Bush only a heartbeat away from the presidency, he has become exceptionally the most powerful White House chief of staff. This article goes on, and Senator John Tower, chairman of the Senate Arms Forces Committee, that's the brother-in-law of Samuel Cummings, the world's largest arms dealer, who I mentioned many times, works with Wilson, Terpil, Coca-Cola, and the highest echelon of the CIA. Samuel Cummings was in the CIA and is, and lives in London, Monte Carlo, and Ireland, brother-in-law of John Tower. This is a who's who of Texans, including attorney Robert Strauss, being touted as the Democratic presidential candidate. He was under the pay of the Howard Hughes organization at the time of Watergate, and the offices of Strauss and also John Connally's law offices and Jaworski's. They've opened branches in Washington, D.C., as well as Houston. It describes Bell Helicopter with their important lobbyists in Washington, D.C., and the money that's being put into Washington for property from Clint Murchison and from Mel Crow and very prominent Washington people. Texas, indeed, is on the Potomac. It is in California. It is everywhere. And, of course, the turning point, I believe, happened in Dallas, Texas, November 22nd, 1963. Another important article that came out to refute some of the outright lies that Alexander Haig has been pushing, and I always call him the Reichstag Haig because he will build his career and whip up the ladder of terrorism, communist Moscow to the hilt in order to increase the police force, the CIA, and our police department domestically, and get more arms and weapons to keep control of the native population here. When the food gets tight, when the unemployment comes, the excuse will be that there's terrorists. They will be simply hungry people rioting and burning down if they don't have money for food or heat or whatever. Haig and Reagan are experts at whipping up the international terrorist story, even though it doesn't hold water. And there was a long article in the New York Times this week on Alexander Haig. It was titled "Soviet Terror Ties Called Outdated." And it goes into the fact that the United States intelligence community has said that Alexander Haig's speeches from the time Ronald Reagan became president, starting with February 28, 1981, are 10 years old, that they're based on accusations that have no true information. And this came out of the New York Times. It said that the terror stories of Alexander Haig are outdated, that Ronald Reagan, early in his administration, charged that the Soviet Union was directly helping terrorists, that this was based on information 10 years ago by a Czech defector who is not reliable. What we're hearing, according to the New York Times, is 10-year-old testimony, and that's what I was saying on KLRB in January and February when they were spouting these outright lies. This study comes from the CIA. It says there's no substantial evidence or links of the USSR to terrorism, and it goes into the early stories of a Major General Sejna, S-E-J-N-A, who came to the United States in 1968 and told Western intelligence that groups like the Baader-Meinhof in Germany and the Red Brigades in Italy were trained by the Russians. And the evidence today says this isn't true, and they are calling Alexander Haig literally a liar. What they said was that in the early 60s, the Kremlin helped people like the Libyans, the Iraqis, the North Koreans, the Angolans for wars of national liberation. They did not set up terrorist organizations. And later, the centers that were set up to teach people about national liberation were infiltrated by people used by the Libyans, money pouring into these centers to train the PLO, the Baader-Meinhof, the Red Brigades, the Japanese Red Army, and Carlos the Jackal, that these people were trained specially that had nothing at all to do with the Soviet Union. There was no direct link. The CIA said of these groups, terrorist groups, to the Soviet Union, no evidence to support it of any kind. And William Colby, the director of the CIA, was saying that the Soviet centers set in motion the activity for these terrorist groups. But that is not saying the Russians did it. In California, there was a Black Panther movement, there was the Indian movement, the United Prisoners movement, the United Farm Workers movement, and there were various social movements in the 60s, and then they became infiltrated with violent people. Even the rock concerts, the hippie movement, Woodstock was nothing like Altamont when the agents came in and began to make it violent. And the original intent at People's Park and elsewhere was to express natural feelings. And this article says that Haig has been not telling the truth, and that his speech, imagine the Secretary of the State using information that's 10 years old that has no basis in fact, but if he says it loud enough and says it often enough, as Adolf Hitler taught, it becomes a fact. Jack Anderson had an article last week called Bombshell, and this wasn't last week, it was October 1980. I cut this out, and when he said the secret conclusion from the Justice Department files has said that, in fact, the United States is a worldwide supplier of hardware and technology to support military terrorism around the world, that CIA personnel and special forces are teaching terrorism, and that it's coming from the United States of America. Another article this last week from the Washington Post, terrorism is declining in the United States. It's declining when the government agents don't have provocateurs. When Reagan infiltrates with the new CIA escalating inside the United States, you will have the increase of terrorism, because it will be agents disguised as legitimate people with griefs. Just as you have the anti-nuclear protests, they're peaceful now. When he unleashes the CIA, the anti-nuclear people will be meeting with violent persons that will give the group a bad name. There was another article a while back, a UPI story, that Frank Terpil and Edwin Wilson were training, and I've read this before, Italy's Red Army, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the Irish Republican Army. These men were arming terrorist groups as well as the CIA, and this is a point some people still don't understand. I get letters about the Central Intelligence Agency can send weapons to the Red Brigade in Italy, and they can send weapons to Licio Gelli, who's an outright fascist in Italy. They send weapons to Great Britain to fight the Irish, and they send the IRA weapons to fight the British. We send weapons to the PLO to fight the Israelis, and we send Israel weapons to bomb the PLO. The only place where you don't get the factions fighting each other is in the pure Nazi countries that control the government totally, such as Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay. These countries don't have opposing groups fighting each other because they have a fascist government in power already. The purpose of arming both sides is to destabilize those countries and keep them off their guard and create the excuse for the fascist police to come in. The speeches about terrorism that Haig continues to give, or Reagan wants to give, have no basis in fact, and certainly day after day there are articles coming out about our intelligence community sending pilots to bomb Chad. We send the weapons to Sudan to protect them against Chad. We send to Idi Amin to have terrorism in Uganda, and now he's living in Saudi Arabia. But when he was in Uganda, and the CIA sent in weapons for him to torture, and then we send in money to stop him and get him out of power. The purpose, as I say, is to destabilize these people and keep them off their guards. And the truth is that there is no basis that the Soviet Union is doing this kind of terrorism at all. Now, last week there was a bombing in Belgium, in Antwerp. an anti-Semitic group in the Jewish quarter. The bombs were blasted, a synagogue was burned, and one more attack. But this time, the people who did the attack called themselves the Direct Action Group, Section Belgium. They don't call themselves by the Red Brigades, the Baader-Meinhof, or whatever. They are Carlos's group, Carlos the Jackal, funded by a violently anti-Semitic CIA. That Jackal is down in South America or Tripoli, and he doesn't have to do these things anymore because he's too closely linked with the intelligence community that's being exposed recently, and they acknowledge they funded him. So now there's individual cells, Nazi cells like the Klan. They say, we are the Direct Action Group Section Belgium. Now there's a Direct Action Group section in Austria. There's one in London. There's in the United States. They're all over the world. They're Nazi cells. And when they bombed this Jewish group in Antwerp, they took credit for it. And they said, we are the same people who were responsible for killing Jews at the Munich Olympic Games. And they listed other places that they had anti-Semitic bombings. They claimed that they were part of the Black September group that attacked the Israeli athletes at the Munich Games and so forth. Well, those same people that killed the 11 Jewish athletes and had the violences in Munich were the Edwin Wilson, Frank Terpil, Theodore Shackley CIA group. So if there's a Direct Action Group Section Belgium, it is the CIA that is continuing their anti-Semitic bombings around the country as soon as this same group that I mentioned put Allende into the grave and Pinochet into power in Chile. The swastikas and the armbands came out. And these type of things will take place until you get the full goose step in every country, and they claim we did the killings at Munich. Now, if they did the killings at Munich and the element that I've been talking about every week takes credit also for doing it, then what they're doing now is just using their specific cell name, and that's who they are. An article in the New York Times, December 28, 1979, said that Mr. Frank Terpil said on tape recordings in New York City that he trained Carlos Ramirez, the Jackal, the Venezuela-born terrorist, that he planned and executed the killings of the Israeli athletes at the 1972 Olympic Games in Munich. Now, if Frank Terpil and these people are taking credit for all of that, and then the people who are bombing these anti-Semitic bombings are taking credit as being part of that group, then this is just a continuation of the same group, and these are not leftist terrorists, these are Nazis, these are funded by the CIA, and they have a lot of links, many countries throughout the world, and their formal organization is known as the Odessa. That's what the Odessa is. It was set up after World War II, and they're getting more flagrant and surfacing now. And what we're getting is our Secretary of Defense saying, if you oppose this kind of faction, you're an appeaser. You have to hate Russia and accept Nazism because otherwise you're an appeaser. There's no logic in the State Department or anything they're saying. Now, getting back to Mr. Terpil and Wilson, two of my favorite subjects, and I think we'll be hearing about them for years to come. Stories broke out in the New York Times and in California the past week. Headline stories about these characters. They read in this way. One was a San Jose Mercury, how the Soviet bloc tries to buy Silicon Valley secrets. That's a deceptive line. The New York Times had a story, indicted ex-agents are linked to area firms. This is out here in California. The New York Times had a larger story by Jeff Gerth and Philip Taubman. Ex-CIA men are linked to the overseas selling of sensitive systems and secret business ties with the ex-CIA agents. Now, I've talked about their offices in Washington, D.C. and in Switzerland and some of their shenanigans, but the real story gets deeper this past week about these characters and who they are, because it takes them out to Sunnyvale, California, to a series of dummy front organizations that then set up their offices in Switzerland, London, and around the world. And these men, and I call them the killer team, this Edwin Terpil and Frank Terpil, and Edwin Wilson, Theodore Shackley, go back to the J.M. Wave connections, to the Kennedy assassination with the anti-Castro Cubans and the CIA, to the Phoenix program in Southeast Asia, and right up to the present day. But now these new articles place them in the laps of Stanford University, the CIA, Hewlett-Packard. Mr. Packard, David Packard, was Assistant Secretary of Defense under Richard Nixon. And we find that Mr. Frank Terpil was the president of an organization in Sunnyvale, California, directly linked to Richard Helms of the CIA in Iran. And the tentacles of these men get more complicated but more easy to understand. And after this 1-minute break, I'm going to try and go slowly to jump to these California connections so that in the weeks to come, you'll be able to get a better overview of who these characters are that I'm talking about.
This concludes the first half of World Watchers International with Mae Brussell. We will return with the second half after a brief pause.
Okay. Now, what I want to say about these articles coming out in the New York Times and the San Jose Mercury about the links of these characters to California goes back to several, 4 or 5 major premises that I've had over a period of 18 years of research. It's almost 18 years this November. The first I have said is the allegations that terrorism, the kind that I'm talking about, the kind that Ronald Reagan or Alexander Haig are using, and Ronald Reagan used in California for 8 years, is a product of what the Defense Department and CIA called Operation Chaos, the FBI called COINTEL. It's manufactured terrorism that comes from specific places, operations, and funds to create chaos. Secondly, part of the chaos involves the unleashing of murderers and assassination teams that can kill presidents, journalists, congressmen, judges, civil rights leaders, and so forth, and rock musicians and Jews, blacks, Indian, Chicano leaders. Third, the center for selecting the presidents that will carry on this kind of terror has been in California, coming from Stanford, California, from Stanford Research, from the mind control programs, from Los Angeles, from the public relations firms that sell you people like Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, those organizations. And fourth, I believe that specific agents are involved in spreading terror, such as the Theodore Shackleys, William Colby's, George Bush, the Henry Kissinger's, Richard Helms, and so forth, William Casey, John Connally. These people are in the business of spreading terror and setting up these assassination teams. And finally, I believe that their main goal is to control the world's narcotic traffic and put the politics into the form of the military dictatorship that Mr. Schmitz of the John Birch Society talks about. Now, in California, there was a company set up called Stanford Technology, and this is from an article in the New York Times. You can all get it and read it later if you want, and I want to give you just an outline of how important this story is that broke on these subjects. This story was in the New York Times October 13th, just last week. There's a company in Palo Alto called Stanford Technology in Sunnyvale, California, right near Palo Alto. It became a subsidiary of Analog Devices in 1981, but it began as Stanford Technology. And it was formed in 1975 by an Iranian by the name of Albert Hakim, Hakim, who lived in Iran, Tehran, and Richard Helms of the CIA, who is in charge of our mind control and our zombie assassins, was sent in disgrace over to Iran in 1973 to become the ambassador after the Watergate slap on the wrist he got for perjuring himself about the Yendi murder. Richard Helms went over to Iran, but he didn't stop his CIA activity, and he could link up with Albert Hakim, who came from Tehran all the way from Richard Helms and Iran out to Sunnyvale, California, the heart of Silicon Valley, with the most sensitive secrets and computer work for United States defense. And in 1974, Hakim, when he came to this country, was working over in Iran for Hewlett-Packard organization. Now, Hewlett-Packard is a well-known commercial organization, a large supplier for the defense industry. The members of the Hewlett-Packard firm, David Packard, former, as I say, Deputy Secretary of Defense, is a strong advocate of a firm line in dealing against the Soviet Union. And Mr. Hewlett also, they have a reputation for being very strong against the Soviet Union. As a matter of fact, in the book Global Reach, the story of multinational corporations, William Hewlett of Hewlett-Packard was important. He was on the board of directors of the Chase Manhattan Bank with John J. McCloy and David Packard, also partner. Hewlett was a partner of David Packard. And between the Defense Department and Chase Manhattan, they had very strong anti-Soviet feelings. So we're not talking about equipping the Soviet Union with electronic equipment. Albert Hakim worked for Hewlett-Packard in Tehran, which is one of the largest suppliers of the Defense Department, and Richard Helms, one of the geniuses behind our mind control zombies, and that operation and counterintelligence through the whole Cold War was in Iran with Albert Hakim, and he takes a trip out to Sunnyvale, California, and sets up a firm. He has it set up in Delaware, but the offices are out here in California in 1974. And in 1975, they began their dealings in Turkey. They were to send electronic equipment to Turkey, but it had to be through companies overseas because Turkey had invaded Cyprus, so it was illegal to do it over the table. So again, the subterfuge of sending to Turkey. And of course, with their heavy operations in Iran, I think of how the Shah was forced to leave and he died, and Shah, who shot the Pope, came from Turkey and was strongly linked to the Grey Wolves and the Nazi organization in Turkey. Whether or not he worked Shah through Hewlett-Packard, I don't know yet, or we may never know. But they set up operations in Turkey in 1975, Switzerland 1974, and then Frank Terpil came out and joined this corporation, Stanford Technology, but he became president of their subsidiary called Intercontinental Technology Incorporated. They gave him his own name, but it was under Stanford Technology. In 1976, Stanford Technology was sending weapons with CIA agents into Egypt. 1977, they were working with people inside the Soviet Union, and they were sending weapons to Idi Amin, and Edwin Wilson joined this group in 1977. But Mr. Hakim came over here from Iran to Sunnyvale, California, where he set up Stanford Technology, which had a subsidiary, Intercontinental Technology Incorporation, that Frank Terpil was the president of. And then he set up offices in Washington, D.C., Geneva, London, and in Sunnyvale, California. And then Wilson joined Terpil. So Terpil was the president of this group, and this group worked with Hewlett-Packard and right under the nose of Stanford University. And most of the people here were all involved in CIA and defense operations. Now, Edwin Wilson had offices in Washington, D.C. He worked in Office of Navy Intelligence with Bobby Inman, who's now Deputy Director of the CIA. He worked with Henry Kissinger, Theodore Shackley, and all of the heavies that have been in counterintelligence throughout the world. And Wilson then in Washington set up 127 dummy front organizations, so that these people were literally covering the entire globe. And they're very important because of their ability to get around the world and have these offices in Switzerland and be supplying Egypt and the PLO and goodness knows where else. They had direct links down to the Guggenheim Bank in Australia and were supplying Colonial Dignidad, the Torture Center, and Michael Townley of the CIA. And they had international links with all kinds of operations. But the important thing was that they got their cover for much of their work from an Iranian from Tehran who worked there where Richard Helms was, so that Richard Helms never stopped working for the CIA. He could be the ambassador of Iran, but the point is he could make this giant leap over to Sunnyvale, California, and set up these offices. Now, there's a fascinating book called The Last Days of America by Edwin, and it's a story about a man named Frank Rogers, not Frank Terpil, who passes by the Stanford area and goes down to Sunnyvale, California, the same city, and he's sent to Switzerland for selling missiles and secret weapons and defense machinery in Switzerland. And when he gets to Switzerland, the office that he's working for is actually in Belgium and in Germany, and it's the IG Farben. And this book, The Last Days of America, is how the German corporation IG Farben takes control of America and squeezes America, and how the Fourth Reich resurrects again. This is the man who wrote the book, The Crash of 79, Erdmann. But it begins, and you get into the book, and it's fascinating because it goes right from Sunnyvale, California, to Switzerland, to IG Farben and Belgium. And the people in these companies set up all kinds of offices to conceal what they were doing. Stanford Technology became part of Analog Devices, and then they set up other offices, I say, in 75 in Turkey, and then they had the dummy fronts go into the hundreds later. And meanwhile, Mr. Hakim worked for Hewlett-Packard. He was a representative in Iran, very much part of the Defense Department, and another man who worked in California in one of their subsidiaries also worked for Hewlett-Packard. They set up the Intercontinental Technology Incorporated, the International Imaging Systems, the Stanford Technology Group set up different offices and transactions with all kinds of names. But the important thing was that the men that were involved with the Omega-7, the anti-Castro Cubans, the bombings and blowing up of airplanes, silencers bought from Mitchell were Bell, assassination silencers, the Alpha 66, the Frank Sturgis that was involved in Watergate with the Kennedy assassination coming out of Miami, the Nazi links to Australia and South America. The home base came from California for these people, which is perfectly natural considering William Colby coming back from Southeast Asia after the Phoenix program, setting up what I said was the SLA is the CIA, and the rash of terrorism to break the radical movements in California when the Vietnam War was over. I know that most of the mind control in this country, the home base is Atascadero, Vacaville, private hospitals in San Francisco, all throughout this state, that the crazies come here, get their mind control programming, go back east or wherever it is to kill. But California is the basis. UCLA, the Center for Mind Control, the Stanford Research, the University of California up in San Francisco. When Candy Jones wrote her book on working for the CIA, she came out to San Francisco and Oakland. And Candy Jones is very interested in a case that is now coming out to the West Coast, and she's concerned. She's a radio announcer in New York, and she's been talking about the David Berkowitz story. And now we bring that, the son of Sam, back to California because there are stories in New York. And finally, out here on the West Coast, the San Jose Mercury yesterday had a story about Son of Sam. The lead story on this was Son of Sam's mysterious clue to the Stanford slaying. And it seems that David Berkowitz, the notorious Son of Sam, who now they're admitting didn't do all the shootings, if he shot a few, the gun was passed around. David Berkowitz was arrested in New York City and claimed the credit for the 6 murders and the other attempted murders. And while he was in jail, he was sending letters out that he knew about a murder of a woman, Arliss Perry, who died at the Stanford Chapel in 1974, that he was with the person who killed her. before he was arrested, and even before he did the long series of, or was involved with these series in New York City, that he knows the person who killed her, who bragged about her. He knows where the wounds were located, where the weapon was inside of her. Now, as far as the chronology of this case, which is interesting to me because I've studied the David Berkowitz as being part of what I call, we have our California zombies, and these mind-controlled killers that have been released to do and spread terrorism throughout this country, but particularly in California. We had a whole bloody era of that. Then all of a sudden, Berkowitz showed up in New York, and I believed he was like our California zombies. But interesting enough, he is linking his association or knowledge to this one particular murder. Now, in February 15th of 1973, a Leslie Perloff was murdered in Palo Alto. She was a graduate from Stanford University. She was a law clerk. She was going into law school soon, and she was murdered leaving the law library. October 13th, 1 year later, 1974, Arliss Perry was murdered in Palo Alto at the Stanford Memorial Chapel. She was working for a law firm in Palo Alto. In 1976 to 1977 were the Son of Sam murders, or the ones that he was involved with in New York City, and he was arrested in September of 77. And in 1979, he started to say that he knew who killed Arliss Perry in California. Now, that interested me, and there is an investigator on the Son of Sam case named Maury Terry. And various people who subscribed to these tapes in New York told him to contact me because I had information or clues to the David Berkowitz affair in New York City. Now, I believe that the California violences were all linked, and if Berkowitz has information on one of the cases, like Arliss Perry, it would apply to the other people. I had the unfortunate experience of meeting a person who was brought to my home in 1974. This woman, a young girl, wanted to do research, wanted to help me. She knew Peter Dale Scott in the Bay Area and Paul Krasner, and she was going to come to my house, and she kept begging to come and help me with my files, and she said she'd come alone, and finally one Sunday I said, okay, you can come down for the day. And she indexed a book for Peter Dale Scott, a fine researcher, and she wanted to come down. And when she came, she brought a man. And I said, I thought you were going to be alone. And she said, oh, I'm very sorry. It's just a friend of mine, and he's going to do some skin diving down at Point Lobos. He just wanted to take your picture. And I was simply furious. He left. He says, okay, I'll go. And she yelled, come back at 5. And I made her sit in the living room, except for going to the bathroom. I wouldn't let her leave the chair. I said, you told me you would come alone, and who is this person? And I had a very weird feeling about him. And I took down information about him and wrote a description as much as I could, as I did at the time in January when John Hinckley Jr., I believe it was him as much as I would ever know anything, was at the house in January, and I've gone into that on these programs. Well, anyway, he picked her up at 5. She walked out the door and left, and I asked the name and wrote the license number. And then she called me several weeks later and apologized. She said, I should never have brought him to your house. He's the fellow who killed Leslie Perloff at Palo Alto outside the library. And I said, thanks a lot. She said, I think I should tell you that he is the one, and I feel guilty for bringing him because he claims that he killed her. Now, his description of the man who was at my home that she brought fits exactly the description that Maury Terry in New York City told me, he's very close to David Berkowitz, told me was at the law office with this particular woman, Arliss Perry, spending 15 minutes or so with her shortly before she was murdered. Somebody came into the office, she knew him intimately, and I think this is a break in the case that would take it away from the cult, the queer kind of linkage that they're trying to do, a cult murder, to a real hard-ass Nazi, fascist, white International Guard that have been behind these campus murders, these freeway murders, these slashers, the Oda family, the Manson family, the entire California syndrome of murder after murder that I have listed and can compile again for you if you want me to go on in a certain order and make sense out of them. Now, Berkowitz claims that he knows the person who was responsible for this one murder, and he has all the details. And hopefully, maybe if I work with the proper people, we can get some perspective on these. Interesting enough, Arliss Perry, as I say, worked at a law firm in Palo Alto, and somebody was there that she seemed to know. Leslie Perloff was also working at the law library as a clerk at the law library. Now, another fellow involved with the law, a lawyer from a wealthy family law office, was stalking Caroline Kennedy this last couple of months. He's from a wealthy Palo Alto family. A lawyer in law office, went to Hastings Law School. He went to New York City, went to the Metropolitan Museum where she works, and asked, "Is that her?" And Carolyn heard somebody say, "She's over there." Some reference to where she would be. He spoke to her. She had no interest in him. When she got to the apartment, he was at her apartment. He had a map, and it's pretty hard to find the apartment or get inside the hall of where Caroline Kennedy lives in New York City. Most of these apartments have double locks or keys, but he was able to stalk her. She was afraid that this would be like a Chapman or a Hinckley affair, and they went ahead and prosecuted him. But the question is, where did he find her? Why did he ask, who is that? And they said, "That's her. There she goes." And then he came up to her. How does he get inside the apartment? How did he know where she lives? And the important thing about this particular character is that he threatened, well, forget my proposal to marry you, but the next time I will, and he used a profanity, "to all of your relatives unless you marry me." Now, he's threatened to get the rest of her relatives, which would be maybe her cousin, Robert Kennedy Jr., or Ted Kennedy's son, or any of the young Kennedys that want to be political in the future. Kevin King, a lawyer from California, from a very wealthy family, was able to find Caroline Kennedy, to keep reappearing, calling her house, getting the phone number. So this has to be a higher level of intelligence, inside information. But the stage is set like the book Black Abductor, with the story of the kidnapping of Patty Hearst, that the full life cycle of the young Kennedys is definitely threatened. He has on the record now that he will be going after her relatives. If he's rejected by her, the relatives will get it. So you can be sure that the young male political relatives of the Kennedys have fair warning, and it comes from a wealthy lawyer from Palo Alto, California, another law office. It's interesting how many law offices are involved in these cases, and these are just a few. Now, what I try to explain to this fellow working on the Berkowitz case, that none of these murders, I don't believe, except for testing the stomach of particular people, are random murders, and he agreed with me. They have a meaning. He doesn't see the meaning yet, Terry, in the East Coast, because he hasn't worked on it from this angle. He's looking for some weird occult group and not an international white guard fascist Nazi group that are doing these things. And I explained the reason there were murders of priests or a devout Christian girl like this Miss Perry, or a murder in a Stanford chapel, was that one of the purposes of this kind of violence is to show the Antichrist and the Christ lovers as opponents. When I wrote in 1974 the story, The SLA is the CIA, I wrote 15 motives for the creation of the SLA by William Colby of the CIA and Richard Helms before him with the mind control. And 13th of the 15 motives was to link the demons to the devil, or to communists, or to radicals, and to make the right thinking appear to be Christians. And I wrote, this was 1974, Christian and Christ versus radical and terrorists. The Christianity, the family, and God are fighting for survival today with social change and radical politics, always being associated with the Antichrist. I wrote that Colston Westbrook and the CIA came to set up the SLA. He came from the Christian University in Tokyo. That Wes Davis of the CIA was an authority on the evils of communism and Antichrist, and worked for the World Humanity Against Totalitarianism, a Christian organization. That CIA agent William Buckley criticized Randolph Hearst for appeasing the SLA because his daughter should be sacrificed in the name of Christ. The woman involved, the Persoff murder, the woman who was murdered at Stanford prior to the Perry murder, the same gal that was at my house told me and intimated some connections to E. Howard Hunt and William Buckley. She was vague about them, but brought their names into that case, and he was very quick to say to Randolph Hearst that the SLA story is the Christ versus the Antichrist. And I made a statement in 1974 of the use of kidnappings and bombings by police provocateurs that would set up Christians that would appear to be sacrificed by the Antichrist. And that's why I believe the emphasis on the Manson family or the Berkowitz ties to the cult is a diversionary from the real story. I believe there's more to this story than the writers and researchers know or want to believe, and they're going to have to change their way of looking at affairs before they ever solve these murders. They will remain unsolved unless they get serious about the origin of these particular murders. Now, a fellow in the U.S. Senate, not the U.S. Senate, the State Senate, Ed Davis, is very popular. There's a large article about him in the paper this week, Los Angeles Times. Ed Davis has a new image, effective legislator. He was the head of the criminal conspiracy section in Los Angeles that set up Donald DeFreeze and Louis Tackwood and counterintelligence. It was his office that actually, with the FBI, fabricated evidence that the Amnesty International talked about this week with Geronimo Pratt, the Black Panther leader that was framed through lies. That came out of the Los Angeles Police Department. This Ed Davis was put in with the most money of any senator in California, came to him from the Mike Curb Productions that are linked to David Murdoch and the Richard Mellon Scaife of the far right, Richard Vagary from the Young Americans for Freedom, another direct link to the Mellons, and counterintelligence operations. Ed Davis had the most money that any person could have to run for a state senator, and he's trying to get an aura of respectability now that he's left the LAPD. The same week that they have a huge picture of Ed Davis being a great California senator, the Los Angeles Times has a large article, A Challenge to American Justice, with a picture of Geronimo Pratt, and another article about Sirhan trying to get parole. Again, faked by Ed Davis, the evidence, the story of who killed Robert Kennedy. What I'm trying to say, to summarize some of these names that I'm throwing out this evening, is that the terrorism that we had in California when Reagan was governor, the Robert Kennedy assassination, the Black Panther operations, the San Quentin Six, the Chowchilla kidnappings came later when Jimmy Carter just became president. The California terror syndrome is a product of our mental hospitals, of the CIA, using specifically the California locations to spread stories like the Manson family, the SLA. These were the babies of the intelligence systems of the FBI, the Defense Department, Navy intelligence, and various assassination teams for the express purpose of having in this country the same kind of off-guard terrorism that creates the necessity for computers to have in the police departments. The same people that created the Baader-Meinhof in Germany, the Red Brigades, the Japanese Army, or Carlos in Europe, created the Black Guerrilla family, and even some of the Weathermen and some of the counterintelligence people that surfaced this week. I believe that the Weathermen and the bomb caches, the Black Guerrilla, surfacing at this time is simpatico with the way Reagan ran the state when he was the governor. When he wants tight CIA bills to have CIA agents in police departments and local organizations, he creates the excuse, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we get these old worn-out guys from the 70s, the bomb factories, the Black Guerrilla. It's like a deja vu to have to live through this darn thing. You study it, you know it's going to come, you know how they orchestrate it, and all of a sudden there's bomb factories all over the place. And many of those people that set up these operations, the that brought us the police, that brought us the COINTEL program and the excuses for Operation Chaos, they just fade away or disappear, became prosperous when it was all over. People like Timothy Leary and Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin made no social change of any kind, but managed to bring on more police, more surveillance, and more Alexander Haigs and Ronald Reagans, who will have more to talk about terrorism. But the important thing is that Berkowitz in New York City knows a lot about murders in California. Why? Because he's out of that same mind control program in South Korea. When he was in the Army, he was against the war. He wanted to come home. They began administering LSD, his program, and his head changed 180 degrees. He began to meet with weird people in New York City who did many killings. And then he was involved with 6 murders. But his mind control work seems to be wearing off, just as Candy Jones did, or Marina Oswald's, the control the CIA had. And as Berkowitz works with some of these investigators, and as they're more willing, say, to call out here and work and ask questions and make connections, it may be that someday there will be a breakthrough. There is enough hard evidence to link the SLA, the Manson family, the California murders, and all these violences to a network of the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Department. And all we need are a few good investigators who finally catch on the modus operandi, and once they get it, the pieces will fall into place. I've saved a lot of those pieces. I hope they're useful. I'm helping some of these people now to ask the right questions, and hopefully enough energy will be put in to understand what happened to this country and how Reagan wants to pursue it and start all over again. The thing is to stop it now before he gets enough muscle to create it again. In the meantime, we're over this hour one more time. Have a good week, and I'll be back with you again next week. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.